November 2019. The crisp chill of late autumn swept through Somersville, Vermont, as the town prepared for Thanksgiving. Streets were adorned with wreaths and lights, and homes buzzed with anticipation of family reunions. But behind the cozy facades of St. Mary's Community Church and the charming storefronts of Asfar's Groceries, a storm was quietly brewing, one that would shatter the peace of this picturesque town. In the heart of Somersville, Emma Thornton was known as the quintessential Christian wife. At 42, she exuded an air of poise and compassion, often seen organizing food drives and greeting congregants with her warm smile. Her husband, James, was a successful businessman, the picture of stability, though his absences had grown longer over the years. To the outside world, they were a model couple, but behind closed doors, Emma's life was a void of cold silences and unspoken resentment. She had once felt alive in James' presence, back when their marriage was filled with shared dreams and whispered promises. Now, the love they had built seemed buried beneath years of routine and detachment. Emma often found herself wandering through her days, searching for a flicker of the passion that had long since faded. Across town, Rami Asfar, a 20-year-old man with quiet eyes and a reserved demeanor, worked tirelessly in his family's grocery store. His father, Ferris, ran the shop with pride, believing it to be the backbone of their family's legacy since immigrating from Lebanon. Rami respected his father's devotion but felt trapped beneath the weight of expectations. Somersville, with its tightly knit Christian community, never felt like home. Rami longed for something more, something that would make him feel less like an outsider in his own life. The two worlds collided on a sunny September afternoon at St. Mary's Community Church, where Emma was volunteering at a local food drive. Rami had reluctantly come along, urged by his mother, Layla, who believed it was important to engage with the community. He kept his head down, stacking canned goods, until Emma approached him with her usual warmth. "First time volunteering here?" she asked, her tone light but curious. Rami hesitated, unsure how much to say. Yeah, my mom thought it would be good for me," he finally replied, his voice low but steady. Emma smiled, sensing his unease. "Well, welcome. It's good to have young energy around here." That brief interaction might have been the end of it, but fate had other plans. Over the weeks, Emma and Rami found themselves crossing paths more often. At first, it was innocent, short conversations about life in Somersville, shared jokes about the town's lack of excitement. But there was something unspoken in their exchanges, a connection neither dared to name. For Emma, Rami's quiet strength and vulnerability reminded her of something she hadn't felt in years, being seen, being heard. For Rami, Emma's warmth was a beacon in a life that often felt cold and isolating. Their conversations became longer, their encounters more frequent. What began as fleeting moments of connection began to stir emotions neither of them expected. By October, their meetings had shifted from public spaces to the secluded Maplewood Lake, where the golden hues of autumn leaves shielded them from prying eyes. It was there, under the canopy of a dying season, that their bond deepened into something forbidden, a love neither could resist, nor fully understand. But Somersville was a town that thrived on whispers. And whispers have a way of becoming storms. To understand the storm brewing in Somersville, one must first grasp the worlds of its key players, their struggles, their hopes, and the fault lines waiting to fracture. Beneath the town's quaint facade lay the lives of Emma Thornton, James Thornton, and Rami Asfar, each carrying burdens invisible to the world yet destined to collide. Emma Thornton was Somersville's golden woman. She was the type who made casseroles for grieving neighbors and planned the town's charity auctions. People admired her, envied her, even. To them, Emma seemed to have it all, a beautiful home, a devoted husband, and an impeccable reputation. But Emma knew the truth. Her marriage to James was like the pristine lace curtains in their two-story colonial house, outwardly perfect, but thin, fragile, and full of tiny, unnoticed tears. James, a man once brimming with ambition and charm, had retreated into the cold confines of his work. Over the years, his absences became less about providing for the family and more about escaping it. When he was home, his words were brief, his touches rare, and his affection non-existent. Emma tried to fill the void. She baked, she volunteered, she stayed busy. But no matter how much she gave to others, the ache inside her grew. She longed for something, someone, to remind her that she was more than just the shadow of a wife she had become. This emptiness made her vulnerable, though she refused to acknowledge it, even to herself. James Thornton's world revolved around order. As the CEO of a small but thriving logistics firm, he was known for his sharp mind and no-nonsense demeanor. But beneath his confident exterior lay a man driven by fear. Growing up in a chaotic household where betrayal and shouting matches were common, James had learned one thing: control was the only way to ensure survival. His marriage to Emma had once been an escape from that chaos. She was his sanctuary, his reminder that stability could exist. But as the years wore on, James began to see Emma's needs as demands, her warmth as a distraction. He focused on work, where his efforts yielded tangible results: profits, growth, respect. At home, the relationship that once felt like a refuge now felt like an obligation. James noticed the changes in Emma, how she lingered too long at the window, how her laughter grew quieter, how her absence from their bed felt more deliberate than coincidental. But he told himself it was nothing. She was still Emma, still his wife. She wouldn't stray. She wouldn't betray him. She wouldn't leave. Yet deep down, the boy who grew up fearing abandonment couldn't let go of the suspicion gnawing at him. Rami Asfar had spent his entire life navigating the line between two worlds, the strict traditions of his family and the open, often unspoken pressures of assimilation in Somersville. His father, Faris, a proud immigrant from Lebanon, had instilled in him the values of hard work, discipline, and unwavering faith. Faris ran Asfar's groceries with an iron will, often reminding Rami that the store was their lifeline, the symbol of their survival in a foreign land. Rami respected his father's sacrifices but chafed under his expectations. He was 20, yet his life felt predetermined. His future lay behind the counter of a small grocery store, serving the same customers who glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Somersville was kind, polite even, but Rami always felt the undercurrent of being other. He was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, no matter how much he tried. His mother, Layla, understood his struggles better than Faris did. She saw the way Rami stared out the window after long shifts, the way he hesitated before answering questions about his plans. She offered quiet words of encouragement, but even her warmth couldn't bridge the growing gap between Rami and the life his family envisioned for him. Inside, Rami carried a secret longing, to break free, to live a life unbound by duty and expectation. He wasn't sure what that life looked like, but he knew it wasn't in Somersville, until Emma Thornton walked into his world. Somersville itself played a role in what was to come. The town, with its cobblestone streets and white-steepled church, thrived on appearances. Neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles while trading whispers behind closed doors. Reputation was everything, and deviation from the norm was met with raised eyebrows and quiet judgment. The Asfar family, while respected for their hard-working ethic, was often viewed through the lens of quiet prejudice. They were the only Muslim family in a predominantly Christian community, and while no one outright rejected them, they existed on the periphery, always present, never fully included. Faris believed this was the price of survival, but Rami saw it as a barrier he couldn't overcome. The Thorntons, in contrast, were pillars of the community. James' success and Emma's charity work made them untouchable, or so it seemed. But beneath the polite veneer of Somersville, rumors had a way of spreading like wildfire, and the whispers had already begun. In these three lives, Emma's yearning for love, James' desperate need for control, and Rami's desire for freedom, the seeds of tragedy had been planted. Somersville, with its tight-knit community and unspoken rules, would become the crucible where secrets boiled over. No one knew it yet, but the cracks were forming, and the weight of hidden desires was about to fracture everything. By the time October arrived, the golden leaves of autumn had begun to carpet the quiet streets of Somersville. For Emma Thornton and Rami Asfar, the changing season mirrored the transformation of their connection, a bond that had grown from fleeting glances to something far deeper, and far more dangerous. It started innocently enough. After their brief interaction at St. Mary's Community Church, Emma and Rami began noticing each other more often. They crossed paths at the grocery store, exchanged pleasantries during church-sponsored events, and even shared short, friendly conversations in passing. At first, these moments seemed harmless. To Emma, Rami's quiet demeanor and genuine curiosity about the world were a refreshing contrast to the detached indifference she had grown used to in her life with James. For Rami, Emma's warmth and attentiveness were like a beacon in a town where he often felt invisible. But what truly deepened their connection were the conversations, those rare, meaningful exchanges that seemed to strip away the barriers of age, faith, and expectation. During one such moment, while packing donations at the church, Emma casually asked Rami, "Do you ever think about what you'd do if you weren't here?" Rami hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "All the time," he admitted softly. "But I don't think it matters. My father, he expects me to take over the store. It's what I'm supposed to do." Emma's smile faded as she nodded in understanding. "Supposed to do," she repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I know that feeling." Their shared sense of entrapment became the unspoken thread that tied them together. Neither of them acknowledged it outright, but every glance, every word carried the weight of what they both longed for: freedom. By mid-October, their interactions had shifted from casual meetings to deliberate encounters. Emma found reasons to visit Asfar's groceries, often lingering longer than necessary under the pretense of asking about local produce or charity supplies. Rami, who usually avoided prolonged conversations with customers, began looking forward to these moments. They discovered they shared more than just feelings of isolation. Rami opened up about his love for photography, a passion he rarely had time to pursue. Emma revealed her fascination with literature and the books she used to devour before marriage and motherhood consumed her time. These exchanges, though simple, were profound in their intimacy. One crisp afternoon, Rami mustered the courage to ask, "Do you ever feel like you're just living for everyone else?" Emma paused, caught off guard by the raw honesty of the question. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Every day." It was the first time either of them had said out loud what they had been feeling for weeks, that they understood each other in ways no one else could. The change came one chilly evening at Maplewood Lake, a secluded spot just outside town. Emma had mentioned the lake in passing, and Rami had suggested they meet there to discuss the logistics of an upcoming charity event. She agreed, convincing herself it was harmless. The scene was idyllic, autumn leaves drifting lazily on the water, the air crisp and tinged with the scent of pine. They sat on a weathered wooden bench, initially keeping their conversation light. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the tone shifted. "Why do you keep coming to see me?" Rami asked, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. Emma hesitated, knowing the answer but afraid to speak it aloud. Finally, she admitted, "Because you remind me of something I've lost. Something I didn't even realize I was missing." Rami's gaze met hers, the air between them thick with unspoken emotion. "You make me feel like I'm not invisible," he said. "Like I matter." That moment was the tipping point. Neither of them could deny the magnetic pull drawing them closer. What had begun as a friendship born of shared struggles had blossomed into something far more complicated, a connection that both terrified and exhilarated them. From that evening on, their meetings became more frequent and more secretive. Emma and Rami exchanged burner phone numbers to avoid suspicion and began crafting careful excuses to escape their respective lives. Their conversations grew deeper, their stolen moments longer. They shared everything: dreams, regrets, fears, all within the safety of their hidden world. But as their bond strengthened, so did the risks. Emma found herself lying to James more often, explaining away her absences with vague mentions of errands and church responsibilities. Rami, in turn, began neglecting his duties at the grocery store, drawing the attention of his father, Ferris. Yet neither of them could stop. The moments they shared felt like oxygen in a world that suffocated them. Every glance, every touch, every word was a rebellion against the lives they were supposed to live. Still, in the back of their minds, they both knew, Somersville was a town of whispers, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. The walls were beginning to close in, but for now, they chose to ignore the danger, consumed by the forbidden allure of their growing affection. By November, the vibrant reds and golds of Somersville had faded into the muted grays of early winter. The festive spirit of Thanksgiving hung in the air, but for Emma Thornton, Rami Asfar, and James Thornton, it marked the beginning of a storm they could no longer control. James Thornton had always been a man who thrived on certainty. In business, every deal, every decision was calculated. At home, his marriage had been the one constant he believed he could trust, until now. For weeks, he had noticed subtle changes in Emma. She was leaving the house more often, her explanations vague and hurried. Her phone, once left unattended on kitchen counters, was now glued to her side. Her laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in years, returned, but it wasn't for him. She seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere, even during their shared meals. James tried to dismiss these thoughts, convincing himself it was just his own insecurities. But on a chilly November evening, as Emma stood in the kitchen scrolling through her phone, her face lit with a soft smile, James' doubts solidified into suspicion. She was hiding something, and he intended to find out what. The next morning, while Emma was in the shower, James unlocked her phone. It took only seconds for him to stumble upon a message thread with an unnamed contact. Though the texts were carefully worded and devoid of explicit details, they hinted at more, shared jokes, mentions of secret meetings. His chest tightened. Instead of confronting her, James chose to watch and wait. His business acumen kicked in, he would gather evidence, piece by piece, until he was certain. It wasn't just about betrayal, it was about control. He couldn't afford to lose his grip, not on his wife, not on his life. For Rami, the weight of the relationship with Emma was beginning to crush him. What had started as a refuge from his suffocating life was now becoming a source of constant anxiety. Each time his burner phone buzzed, he felt both exhilaration and dread. Ferris had noticed the change in his son. Rami, once punctual and diligent, was now distracted, arriving late to the grocery store and making careless mistakes. One evening, Ferris confronted him. "What's going on with you, Rami? You're slipping. Your mind is somewhere else." Rami looked away, avoiding his father's piercing gaze. "I'm just tired, Baba. That's all." "Tired? From what?" "You're avoiding your responsibilities. Don't forget who you are, Rami. This family has sacrificed everything for you to have a good life here." The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Rami loved his family, but he felt trapped by their expectations. And now, he was lying to them, betraying not just their trust, but everything they had built together. Emma was not blind to the risks she was taking. She saw the tension in James' jaw whenever she left the house, the questions he didn't ask but clearly wanted to. Still, she couldn't stop. Her meetings with Rami were the only moments where she felt truly alive. At Maplewood Lake, their conversations had shifted from light-hearted banter to raw confessions. Emma told Rami about the cracks in her marriage, her fear of growing old and forgotten. Rami shared his dreams of traveling, of escaping Somersville for a life that felt like his own. But with every meeting, the stakes grew higher. Emma started staying out later, offering flimsy excuses about church events or last-minute errands. She told herself it didn't matter, James was too preoccupied with work to notice. Yet, deep down, she knew she was playing with fire. Somersville was a town that thrived on appearances, but appearances often masked curiosity. While Emma and Rami believed their meetings were secret, the town had already begun to talk. At the grocery store, customers lingered longer than usual, their eyes darting to Rami with quiet suspicion. "He's been distracted lately," one woman whispered to another. "And Emma Thornton's been awfully friendly with him." At church, Emma's absences during community events did not go unnoticed. "She's been acting strange," a fellow volunteer remarked. "You don't think?" The whispers were faint, but they carried. And in a town like Somersville, where everyone knew everyone, rumors had a way of becoming truths. The tension came to a head one evening in mid-November. James, now fully immersed in his silent investigation, decided to follow Emma. She had left the house earlier than usual, claiming she was headed to a late church meeting. But James knew better. Staying a safe distance behind, he watched as Emma's car turned off the main road and headed toward Maplewood Lake. His pulse quickened as she parked near the trailhead and stepped out. Moments later, Rami's car pulled in beside hers. From the shadows, James watched them. He saw Emma smile at Rami, the way she leaned in as they spoke, the familiarity in their gestures. His hands clenched into fists. By the time Emma and Rami left the lake, James had already made up his mind. This wasn't just suspicion. It was betrayal. Back at home, James sat in the dimly lit kitchen, replaying the scene in his mind. Each image of Emma with Rami was like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. For Emma and Rami, their bond had become a lifeline. For James, it was a threat that needed to be eliminated. The walls were closing in, and all three of them could feel it. None of them could have predicted just how far things would spiral, but the pieces were already in motion. The storm was no longer brewing, it was about to break. Thanksgiving night in Somersville was a time for gratitude, for family, and for peace. But in the Thornton household, the quiet hum of celebration had been replaced by a suffocating tension. The dining table sat untouched, its centerpiece of fall flowers wilting in the chill of the unlit room. Upstairs, Emma slept fitfully, unaware that her husband, James, had already crossed a line from suspicion to a dark, festering obsession. The hours James had spent watching Emma and Rami at Maplewood Lake replayed endlessly in his mind. He could still see Emma's smile, the way she leaned into Rami with an ease and affection she no longer showed him. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. James felt the walls of his carefully curated life crumbling around him, the control he had fought so hard to maintain slipping through his fingers. That night, as the clock struck 11 p.m., James sat alone in the kitchen, a half-empty glass of bourbon in his hand. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the window. His thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. The image of Emma with Rami wasn't just a memory, it was a wound, bleeding into every corner of his mind. He couldn't let it continue. He wouldn't. James stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the tiled floor. He moved to the counter, where the sharp glint of a kitchen knife caught his eye. His hand hovered over the blade, trembling, as his mind warred with itself. This wasn't premeditated, he told himself. This was justice. Retribution for the life Emma and Rami had stolen from him. Across town, at the Asfar household, the night was unusually quiet. Ferris and Layla Asfar had left earlier in the week to visit family in Boston, leaving Rami alone for the holiday. The house, typically bustling with activity, now felt empty and still. Rami sat in the living room, his phone buzzing with a new message from Emma. She had texted to say goodnight, apologizing for leaving their last meeting early. He stared at the words, a mix of longing and guilt swirling in his chest. He had been thinking about ending things, about the risk, the strain, the impossibility of it all. But every time he tried to imagine a life without Emma, it felt like suffocating. He barely had time to process the thought before the sound of the back door creaking open froze him in place. "Who's there?" Rami called out, his voice steady despite the unease prickling at the back of his neck. The response came not in words but in footsteps, deliberate, heavy, and approaching fast. Rami rose from the couch just as James Thornton stepped into the dim light of the living room, a knife clutched in his hand. The look in James' eyes was enough to send a jolt of fear coursing through Rami's veins. "Mr. Thornton?" Rami stammered, his mind racing. "What are you doing here?" James didn't answer. His breathing was ragged, his grip on the knife tightening with every step closer. "You thought I wouldn't find out?" James spat, his voice low and venomous. "You thought you could take everything from me?" Rami raised his hands, palms out in a gesture of surrender. "I didn't mean," he began, but James cut him off with a growl. "Don't lie to me," James hissed. "You ruined my life. My marriage. My wife. And you think you can just walk away?" What happened next was chaos. James lunged, the knife flashing under the faint light. Rami dodged the first strike, his adrenaline kicking in as he grabbed for the nearest object, a ceramic lamp, and swung it at James. The lamp shattered against James' shoulder, but it wasn't enough to stop him. The two men grappled, their movements frantic and clumsy in the small living room. Rami shouted, pleading for James to stop, but the older man was beyond reason. He struck again, the blade grazing Rami's arm, drawing blood. In desperation, Rami shoved James backward, sending him crashing into the coffee table. For a brief moment, Rami thought he had gained the upper hand. But James recovered quickly, his fury undiminished. He lunged one final time, the knife plunging into Rami's side. Rami gasped, his legs giving way as he crumpled to the floor. The room seemed to tilt, the edges of his vision blurring. Blood pooled beneath him, warm and sticky against the cold hardwood. James stood over him, the knife still clutched in his trembling hand. His chest heaved, his mind racing. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't thought it would go this far. And yet, here he was, standing over the lifeless body of a man who had, in his mind, destroyed everything he held dear. For a moment, James simply stared, the silence of the room deafening. The reality of what he had done began to seep in, slow and suffocating. He dropped the knife, the clatter of metal against wood echoing in the stillness. His hands were slick with blood, trembling as he stumbled backward. He fled through the back door, his heart pounding in his ears. The cold night air hit him like a wave, but it did little to clear the fog of panic clouding his thoughts. He crossed the street, slipping back into his own house. Upstairs, Emma still slept, blissfully unaware of the horror that had unfolded just yards away. In the darkened kitchen, James scrubbed his hands under scalding water, watching the blood swirl down the drain. He tried to convince himself that he had done what was necessary, that it was all justified. But as the adrenaline faded, guilt and dread began to take hold. The storm he had unleashed was far from over. By morning, the town of Somersville would never be the same. The morning of November 29, 2019, dawned cold and still in Somersville. Frost coated the rooftops, and a thin mist clung to the streets. The town, still basking in the quiet afterglow of Thanksgiving, had no idea that tragedy had struck during the night. For the Asfar family, the holiday would become a day of unspeakable loss. When Ferris and Layla Asfar returned from their trip to Boston that morning, the house felt unusually quiet. Ferris, always attentive to the smallest changes, noticed immediately. Rami wasn't there to greet them at the door, and the warm, inviting smells of breakfast were absent. "Rami?" Layla called out, her voice echoing through the silent house. Ferris checked the kitchen, the back door, even the small storage room near the garage. But there was no sign of his son. Layla made her way to the living room, pausing at the entrance. She let out a sharp, heart-wrenching scream that cut through the stillness. There, sprawled on the floor, lay Rami. His body was unnaturally still, a dark pool of blood staining the wooden floorboards beneath him. His face, pale and serene, was a cruel contrast to the violence that had claimed his life. Ferris. Layla wailed, collapsing to her knees beside her son. Her trembling hands hovered over his chest, as though touching him might confirm the unbearable truth. Ferris rushed into the room, his heart pounding. The sight of his son's lifeless body stopped him cold. He felt his knees weaken as a crushing wave of grief and disbelief overwhelmed him. He dropped to the floor beside Layla, his hands shaking as he pulled her close. Together, they cried out in anguish, their sorrow filling the house like a storm. The Somersville Police Department responded swiftly. Neighbors, alarmed by Layla's screams, had already dialed 911. Soon, flashing blue and red lights bathed the Asfar home as officers and investigators swarmed the scene. Detective Karen Ellis, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, arrived shortly after. She stepped into the living room, her breath catching at the sight before her. The blood, the overturned coffee table, the shattered lamp, everything pointed to a brutal, personal confrontation. Who would do this? Layla sobbed as she clung to Ferris. Who would kill my boy? Detective Ellis crouched beside them, her voice calm but firm. We'll find out, Mrs. Asfar. I promise you. As the forensic team combed through the house, they quickly uncovered several critical clues. The back door had been forced open, likely the point of entry. Near Rami's body, they found the murder weapon, a kitchen knife, its handle smeared with bloody fingerprints. Detective Ellis turned to one of her officers. Bag the knife. Run prints immediately. Whoever did this wasn't trying to cover their tracks. Meanwhile, officers began questioning the Asfars about Rami's recent behavior. Ferris, his voice choked with grief, mentioned his son's recent distance. He's been distracted. Not himself, Ferris said. I thought it was just the pressures of life. Ellis frowned, scribbling notes in her pad. Did he have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him? Ferris shook his head vehemently. No. Everyone loved Rami. He was a good boy. This doesn't make sense. As news of the murder spread, Somersville's tight-knit community buzzed with speculation. In coffee shops and on front porches, neighbors whispered theories. Some pointed fingers at outsiders, while others wondered if Rami's immigrant background had made him a target. But there were darker rumors, too, ones that linked Rami to Emma Thornton. Didn't I see her talking to him at the grocery store a few weeks ago? One woman murmured to her friend at the diner. It seemed odd. And her husband, James, the friend replied. He's been acting strange lately. You don't think? The whispers were quiet but persistent, weaving their way through the town like threads in a tapestry of suspicion. At the Thornton household, Emma awoke to the sound of James moving about downstairs. She stretched and yawned, unaware of the events that had unfolded just across town. As she descended the stairs, she found James seated at the kitchen table, his face pale and drawn. Morning, she said, her voice soft but cautious. You're up early. James didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the steaming cup of coffee in his hands. Couldn't sleep, he muttered. Emma frowned, sensing something was off. But before she could press him, her phone buzzed with a flurry of notifications. Messages from friends and neighbors filled the screen, each one carrying the same chilling news: Rami Asfar was dead. Her breath hitched as she stared at the words, her mind racing. She fought to keep her expression neutral as she glanced at James. Did he know? Could he know? The thought sent a chill down her spine. By midday, Somersville was in turmoil. The police worked tirelessly, piecing together the events of the previous night. The evidence was damning, but the motive remained unclear, at least for now. The Asfars, drowning in grief, demanded answers. The town, once a sanctuary of peace, felt fractured, its harmony replaced by fear and suspicion. And at the center of it all, Emma Thornton and James Thornton carried their secrets, knowing it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. For the storm that had been brewing for months had finally struck, and its aftermath was far from over. By the first week of December, Somersville was no longer the quiet town it once was. The murder of Rami Asfar had shaken the community to its core, and the air seemed permanently charged with tension. The police investigation had accelerated, and secrets long buried were now clawing their way to the surface. Detective Karen Ellis was nothing if not methodical. The fingerprints on the knife had come back from the lab within days, and the results were damning. They belonged to James Thornton. The evidence was clear, but Ellis knew that proving motive and intent would require more than physical evidence. She needed to understand the why, and for that, she turned to the whispers that had been circulating around town. It didn't take long for the detectives to uncover the connection between Rami and Emma Thornton. Phone records painted a damning picture, dozens of messages exchanged between the two, some as recent as the night of the murder. Interviews with neighbors confirmed suspicions. Emma and Rami had been seen together at the grocery store, at community events, and, most incriminatingly, near Maplewood Lake. Detective Ellis leaned back in her chair, staring at the timeline spread across her desk. The pieces were falling into place. "Get me Emma Thornton," she told her team. "And bring in her husband." When Emma arrived at the station, she was visibly shaken. The town's whispers had reached her ears, and the weight of the murder, and her own guilt, was pressing down on her. She sat across from Detective Ellis, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Thornton," Ellis began, her tone calm but firm, "we know about your relationship with Rami Asfar." Emma flinched, her eyes widening. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, her voice trembling. Ellis slid a folder across the table, opening it to reveal the phone records. "Your messages tell a different story," she said. "You were in contact with Rami the night he died. This isn't a coincidence, Mrs. Thornton. We need the truth." Emma's defenses crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I didn't kill him. I swear I didn't. I cared about him." Ellis nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Tell me what happened." Over the next hour, Emma recounted her relationship with Rami, their shared loneliness, their secret meetings, and the bond that had grown between them. She insisted that she had no knowledge of the murder, but her guilt was palpable. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt." James Thornton was a stark contrast to his wife when he arrived at the station. He sat stiffly in the chair, his jaw clenched and his gaze cold. Detective Ellis wasted no time. "Mr. Thornton," she began, "your fingerprints were found on the knife that killed Rami Asfar. We also know you were aware of your wife's relationship with him. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" James didn't flinch. "I was protecting my family," he said simply. Ellis leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Protecting your family? Or protecting your pride?" For the first time, James' composure cracked. "He was ruining my life," he snapped. "My wife, my marriage, everything I worked for. He had to be stopped." "Is that why you followed him that night?" Ellis pressed. "Why you broke into his house with a knife?" James' silence spoke volumes. The calm, calculating businessman was gone, replaced by a man consumed by rage and regret. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he muttered. "I just wanted to confront him, to make him stay away from Emma." Ellis didn't let up. "But it escalated, didn't it? You lost control." James buried his face in his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to kill him. I couldn't stop." As news of the Thorntons' involvement spread, Somersville erupted with shock and anger. Emma, once the town's golden woman, was now a pariah. Neighbors who had once greeted her warmly now crossed the street to avoid her. The whispers turned to open condemnation. She betrayed her husband, one woman said at the local diner. And now a young man is dead because of it. And James, another added, shaking his head. He thought he could just take justice into his own hands. What a disgrace. The Asfar family, meanwhile, struggled to process the revelations. Ferris, consumed by guilt, blamed himself for not protecting Rami. If I had been here, he told Layla, his voice heavy with sorrow, maybe I could have stopped this. Layla, too heartbroken to speak, simply stared at the empty chair where her son used to sit. Their once bustling home was now a hollow shell, a painful reminder of what they had lost. On December 10, 2019, James Thornton was officially charged with the murder of Rami Asfar. As he was led out of his home in handcuffs, Emma stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. She didn't try to stop him, didn't plead for his innocence. She knew, as did he, that their lives would never be the same. Detective Ellis watched from a distance, her mind lingering on the tragedy that had unfolded. 3 lives destroyed, a family shattered, a community scarred. And for what? A forbidden love, a jealous rage, and a moment of violence that could never be undone. The truth was out, but the wounds it left behind would take far longer to heal. By the time the trial of James Thornton began in the summer of 2020, Somersville was no longer the same quiet town it had once been. The events of the past year had left an indelible mark, not just on the families involved, but on the entire community. In the courtroom, under the watchful eyes of the press and the townsfolk, the truth was laid bare, piece by painful piece. James Thornton stood accused of first-degree murder, and the prosecution wasted no time presenting the damning evidence. The fingerprints on the knife, the surveillance footage of James' car near the Asfar residence, and his own confession painted a clear picture of premeditation and rage. The defense attempted to portray James as a man driven to the brink by emotional torment, a husband betrayed, a man acting in a moment of weakness. But the jury was unmoved. Emma Thornton was called to the stand, her once composed demeanor replaced by visible strain. She recounted her relationship with Rami, her growing distance from James, and the guilt she now carried for her role in the tragedy. Her voice wavered as she described the last message she had sent to Rami, never imagining it would be the final words he would read. I never wanted this, she said, her voice breaking. I thought I could find happiness without anyone getting hurt. I was wrong. Rami's parents, Ferris and Layla Asfar, sat quietly in the front row of the courtroom, their faces etched with grief. They didn't speak during the trial, but their presence was a constant reminder of the life that had been taken. Layla often clutched a small photo of Rami, her fingers tracing its edges as though trying to hold on to the memory of her son. When the jury returned its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder, James showed no visible reaction. He stood stoically as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time since the events of that night, the weight of his action seemed to settle fully on his shoulders. With James behind bars, Emma was left to face the wreckage of her life. Her reputation in Somersville was in tatters. Neighbors who once adored her now avoided her, their judgment heavy and unspoken. She sold the family home and moved to a nearby city, hoping for anonymity. But the shadows of her choices followed her everywhere. The Asfar family, too, struggled to rebuild. Ferris returned to running the grocery store, though it was clear his heart was no longer in it. Layla withdrew from the community, finding solace only in her faith and the memories of her son. The once bustling Asfar home now echoed with silence, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Somersville itself changed in subtle but noticeable ways. Conversations became quieter, trust harder to earn. The town, once so focused on appearances, now carried the weight of a tragedy it couldn't ignore. As the story came to an end, it left behind more questions than answers. Was James Thornton a victim of his own insecurities, or a man consumed by jealousy and pride? Was Emma's search for connection a mistake, or simply a human response to a life devoid of love? And what of Rami? Was he an innocent caught in the crossfire, or did he knowingly risk everything for a love he couldn't have? The threads of this tragedy wove together a complex tapestry of love, betrayal, and the consequences of unchecked emotions. And while the legal chapter of the story had closed, its emotional and moral ramifications would linger for years to come. This is where we turn to you, our audience. What do you think about this story? Do you sympathize with Emma, or do you believe she bears responsibility for what happened? Was James' act a crime of passion or a calculated move born of pride? And what about Rami? Was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was he equally culpable in the events that unfolded? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective. Who do you think was most at fault in this tragic tale, and what would you have done differently? If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking true crime narratives. And don't forget to share this video with friends who might have their own opinions about this complex case. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and let's keep these conversations alive.